Welcome to the family. If you enjoy powerful stories and wild adventures, subscribe now, hit like and share with someone who will love it too. Kira had been observing humans for 3 standard cycles now, ever since her species, the Villani, had made first contact with the Terran Federation. As a xenobiologist assigned to the diplomatic station orbiting Earth, she had witnessed countless interactions between her people and the humans. What fascinated her most wasn't their technology or their political systems, it was their seemingly infinite capacity for patience. The human assigned as her cultural liaison was a man named Tom Brady, though she'd learned that wasn't the famous athlete her fellow researchers kept mentioning. This Tom was different, quiet, methodical, and possessed of what the humans called the patience of a saint. He stood nearly 2 meters tall, with broad shoulders that seemed capable of carrying the weight of worlds, yet he moved with the gentle precision of someone handling delicate crystal. Every morning, Tom would arrive at the observation deck with 2 cups of what humans called coffee, one for himself and one prepared exactly how Kira preferred it, with synthetic sweetener that didn't trigger her species' allergic reactions. He had spent weeks learning the precise temperature and mixture, never complaining when early attempts had made her violently ill. "Good morning, Kira," he would say, his voice carrying that peculiar human warmth that her people found both alien and strangely comforting. Ready for another day of cultural exchange? The Villani delegation had not been easy guests. Kira's superior, Commander Vex, seemed to take particular pleasure in testing human patience. He would arrive late to meetings, interrupt presentations, and make increasingly unreasonable demands about their accommodations. The gravity was wrong, the air mixture was stale, the food was primitive. Nothing satisfied him. Through it all, Tom remained calm. When Vex demanded that the station's gravity be adjusted daily to match Villani preferences, Tom simply nodded and coordinated with the engineering staff. When Vex insisted that all human personnel learn basic Villani etiquette within a week, a task that typically took months, Tom quietly arranged for intensive training sessions and worked 18-hour days to accommodate the request. Kira watched this with growing amazement. In Villani culture, such behavior would have been met with swift retaliation, or at minimum formal complaints filed with the High Council. Yet Tom absorbed each unreasonable demand like a massive tree absorbing rainfall, standing firm, but never breaking. "Why do you tolerate this?" Kira finally asked him one afternoon as they watched the Earth slowly rotate beneath them. "Commander Vex's behavior would be considered deeply insulting among my people. Your patience, it's extraordinary." Tom was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee while considering her words. In human culture, we have a saying, "The best diplomacy happens when both sides feel heard." Your commander is testing us, I think, seeing how far he can push before we push back. It's not personal, it's political. "But surely there must be limits," Kira pressed. "Even human patience must have boundaries." Something flickered across Tom's face then, so quickly that Kira almost missed it. For just an instant, his jaw tightened and his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. Then the moment passed, and his gentle smile returned. "Everyone has limits, Kira. The trick is knowing where they are and making sure you never cross them." As she watched him walk away that day, Kira found herself wondering what would happen if those limits were ever truly tested. She had read the human histories, studied their wars and conflicts. Beneath that infinite patience, she suspected, lay something far more dangerous than her people understood. She had no idea how soon she would find out. The weeks that followed brought escalating tensions that even Tom's remarkable composure couldn't entirely mask. Commander Vex had arrived with what he claimed was a cultural observation mission, but his behavior suggested something far more antagonistic. He began making demands that went beyond unreasonable into actively disruptive. First, he insisted that all station personnel address him with the full ceremonial title used for Villani nobility, a string of honorifics that took nearly 30 seconds to recite. Tom complied, teaching the pronunciation to every human on the station and ensuring they all used it correctly, even though Kira knew Vex held no such rank among their people. Then came the dietary restrictions. Vex claimed that the presence of certain human foods in the station's general areas was causing him spiritual contamination. Tom worked with the food service staff to create separate preparation areas and modified the entire station's meal schedule to accommodate Vex's ever-changing list of objectionable items. Kira watched Tom's responses grow more measured, his movements more deliberate. She noticed he had begun pausing before speaking, taking those extra seconds to choose his words carefully. His morning greetings, while still warm, carried an undertone of careful control. "The commander seems energetic today," Tom observed. One morning after Vex had spent 20 minutes berating a young ensign for failing to bow with the correct angle of deference. "Tom," Kira said quietly, "I need you to understand something about my people. What Commander Vex is doing, this isn't normal Villani behavior. He's deliberately trying to provoke a response." Tom's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "Why?" "There are factions among my people who believe humans are too weak to be trusted as allies. They think your patience is a sign of cowardice, that you'll capitulate to any demand rather than stand firm." Kira's voice dropped to a whisper. "Vex is trying to prove that point to the High Council." For a moment Tom said nothing. Then he set down his cup with deliberate care. "I see." That afternoon, Vex escalated again. He declared that the station's artificial gravity was causing him physical distress and demanded that it be reduced to 60% of Earth normal. This wasn't just inconvenient. At that level, the human crew would struggle to function effectively, and several critical systems would require constant recalibration. Tom listened to the demand in silence, then nodded. "We'll implement the change over the next 48 hours. But Kira saw the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She saw how he excused himself immediately after the meeting, disappearing into his private quarters for nearly an hour. When he emerged, his expression was perfectly composed again, but she noticed he had changed his uniform. The next morning brought the worst provocation yet. Vex had decided that one of the junior human officers, a young woman named Lisa, who worked in communications, was unsuitable for diplomatic contact due to what he called her aggressive posture. He demanded her immediate removal from the station. Kira knew this was a lie. Lisa was one of the most courteous people she'd ever encountered, human or otherwise. The real reason for Vex's complaint was that Lisa had politely declined his inappropriate advances the previous week. Tom listened to the demand in the briefing room, surrounded by both human and Villani staff. Kira watched his face carefully, seeing the micro-expressions that his human colleagues missed. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his breathing became more controlled, the tiny muscle that jumped in his jaw. "I'll need to review Officer Martinez's personnel file," Tom said quietly. "Give me 24 hours to make a determination." As the meeting dispersed, Kira lingered. She needed to warn Tom about what she was seeing, about the dangerous game Vex was playing. But when she approached him, Tom was staring out the observation window at Earth below, his reflection showing an expression she'd never seen before. "Tom?" she ventured. He turned to her, and for just a moment she glimpsed something that made her blood run cold. It was gone instantly, replaced by his usual gentle smile, but she had seen it. Beneath all that patience, something was stirring, something that had been compressed and contained for so long that when it finally emerged, it would be unstoppable. "Is there something you need, Kira?" he asked, his voice as calm as ever. She found herself unable to speak, suddenly understanding that she was witnessing something unprecedented. The moment before a storm breaks, the instant before an earthquake splits the ground, the moment before human patience finally snapped. Kira spent a sleepless night in her quarters, her mind racing with possibilities. She had studied human psychology extensively, but academic knowledge felt inadequate when faced with the reality of what she'd witnessed in Tom's eyes. There had been something primal there, something that spoke to evolutionary depths her people had never plumbed. The next morning, Tom appeared on schedule with their usual coffee, but Kira noticed subtle changes. His movements were more precise, almost mechanical. His smile, while present, seemed painted on rather than natural. Most unsettling of all, he had begun humming, a low, tuneless sound that seemed to emerge without his conscious awareness. "Tom," she began carefully, About Officer Martinez. I've reviewed her file, he interrupted, his voice carrying a flatness that made her scales prickle with unease. Exemplary record. Multiple commendations. No disciplinary actions. He paused, taking a sip of coffee. Nothing that would justify removal. Kira felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Tom continued speaking, his tone conversational but somehow wrong, like hearing familiar music played in a minor key. Of course, Commander Vex has made his position clear. He finds her unsuitable. Tom's grip on his coffee cup tightened almost imperceptibly. I wonder what he would consider suitable behavior from our female officers. The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Kira realized that Tom knew exactly why Vex wanted Lisa removed, and that knowledge was feeding something dark and patient inside him. Before she could respond, the station's communication system crackled to life. All senior staff to Conference Room Alpha. Priority briefing in 10 minutes. They walked to the meeting in silence, Tom's humming continuing as a barely audible undercurrent. Other human personnel they passed seemed to sense something amiss. Conversations died as Tom approached, and several people stepped aside with unconscious deference, as if recognizing some invisible signal of authority or danger. The conference room was already crowded when they arrived. Commander Vex sat at the head of the table, flanked by two other Villani officials who had arrived the previous day. The human senior staff filled the remaining seats, with Tom taking his usual position, near the foot of the table. I have called this meeting, Vex announced, to address the continued incompetence of this station's personnel. His translator rendered his words with typical Villani directness, but Kira caught nuances in his original speech that the humans would miss, deliberate insults woven into what seemed like professional criticism. Yesterday I requested the removal of an unsuitable officer. This request was not immediately granted. Such delays are unacceptable when dealing with matters of diplomatic importance. Kira watched Tom's face, seeing nothing there but polite attention, but his hands, resting on the table, had begun to tremble slightly. Not with fear or nervousness, but with the kind of suppressed energy she'd seen in predators preparing to strike. Furthermore, Vex continued, I have observed numerous examples of disrespectful behavior from your crew. Failure to use proper titles, inadequate bowing protocols, and general disregard for Villani cultural superiority. The word superiority hit the room like a physical blow. Kira saw the human officers stiffen, saw anger flash across several faces, but Tom remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. Therefore, Vex announced, I am recommending to the High Council that this diplomatic mission be terminated and that formal sanctions be imposed on the Terran Federation for cultural incompetence. The silence that followed was deafening. Kira could hear her own heartbeat, could sense the collective held breath of every person in the room. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the point where human patience would meet its inevitable limit. Slowly, deliberately, Tom reached for his coffee cup. He lifted it to his lips, took a measured sip, and set it down with infinite care. When he looked up, his eyes were completely calm. I see, he said quietly. Is there anything else? Commander Vex. Vex's confidence faltered slightly. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. No. That concludes my statement. Thank you. Tom stood up, his movements fluid and controlled. If you'll excuse me, I have some communications to send. As he walked toward the door, Kira felt the hair on her arm stand up. Something fundamental had just shifted in the room's dynamic, something that went beyond words or visible actions. The other humans sensed it too. She could see it in their faces, a mixture of anticipation and concern. Tom paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Without turning around, he spoke in a voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear. Commander Vex, you should know that we humans have a saying, patience is a virtue. But we have another saying too. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking back at the Villani commander. Every dog has its day. Then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt charged with electricity. Kira stared at the empty doorway, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd just witnessed. The breaking point hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming, and when it did, she suspected the galaxy would never be the same. What Kira didn't know, what none of the aliens understood, was that Tom had been meticulously documenting every interaction, every insult, every unreasonable demand. In his private quarters, a detailed file grew daily, cross-referenced with station logs, witness statements, and recorded conversations. Years of diplomatic training had taught him that patience without preparation was merely passivity. While Vex continued his campaign of provocation, Tom worked with quiet efficiency. He filed reports with Terran Command, but more importantly, he began reaching out through unofficial channels to other human diplomats, to alien species who had previous dealings with the Vellani, to academic institutions studying interspecies relations. The picture that emerged was troubling. The Vellani had used similar tactics on 3 other species in the past decade. Each time the pattern was identical. Send an aggressive representative to test the limits of patience, document any signs of weakness or capitulation, then use that evidence to justify territorial expansion or unfavorable trade agreements. 2 species had capitulated entirely, accepting Vellani dominance rather than risk conflict. 1 had responded with immediate violence, which the Vellani had used to justify a devastating preemptive strike that left an entire star system under their control. Humanity, it seemed, was walking a tightrope between submission and provocation, with both outcomes leading to the same destination: subjugation. Kira began to notice changes in the station's routine that she couldn't quite explain. Human personnel moved with increased purpose, their conversations carried undertones of anticipation, and new faces appeared in restricted areas, people who didn't quite fit the standard diplomatic profile. When she asked Tom about it, he smiled that same gentle smile and mentioned something about routine personnel rotations. But these weren't diplomats or scientists. These were people with the controlled movements of soldiers, the alert eyes of intelligence operatives, and the quiet confidence of individuals accustomed to handling dangerous situations. Meanwhile, Vex's demands grew increasingly absurd. He insisted that all station personnel undergo cultural sensitivity training taught by his associates, sessions that were thinly veiled indoctrination programs designed to establish Vellani intellectual superiority. He demanded access to classified human databases for cultural research purposes. He even suggested that the station's command structure be reorganized to place Vellani officials in supervisory roles over human personnel. To each demand, Tom responded with the same measured consideration, the same apparent willingness to find accommodation. But Kira noticed that actual implementation became slower, more complex, tangled in bureaucratic procedures that seemed to multiply exponentially. "I'm afraid that request will require approval from 17 different departments," Tom would say apologetically. "The paperwork alone could take several weeks." Or, "That's an excellent suggestion, Commander. Of course, we'll need to run it through our legal department first, just to ensure compliance with Federation regulations. You understand how these things go." Vex grew increasingly frustrated with the delays, not realizing that each stall tactic was buying Tom precious time to complete his real work. That work came to fruition on a Tuesday morning, just as Kira was, beginning to believe the situation might stabilize into a long-term standoff. She arrived at the observation deck to find Tom waiting with their usual coffee, but his demeanor was different. The careful control was still there, but underneath it, she sensed something like satisfaction. "Good morning, Kira," he said, and his smile was genuine for the first time in weeks. "I have some interesting news to share." Before she could respond, the station's communication system announced an incoming priority transmission from Terran Command. Tom gestured toward the main communications center, where a crowd was already gathering. The transmission was brief but devastating in its implications. A formal complaint had been filed with the Galactic Arbitration Council, signed by representatives from 14 different species. The complaint detailed a pattern of Vellani diplomatic aggression, supported by extensive documentation and witness testimony spanning the past decade. More significantly, the complaint was backed by something unprecedented in galactic politics: a mutual defense compact signed by those same 14 species, pledging collective action against any attempt at unilateral Vellani expansion. Kira stared at the transmission in shock. This wasn't just a diplomatic protest, it was a declaration that the galaxy's patience with Vellani tactics had reached its end. And somehow, impossibly, humanity had orchestrated it all. "How?" she whispered. Tom's smile widened slightly. "We humans have another saying, Kira. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. While Commander Vex was testing our patience, we were building something much more valuable than quick reactions. We were building alliances." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't been passive at all. They had been using Vex's provocations as a catalyst, documenting everything and sharing it with other species who had suffered similar treatment. What Vex had, intended as a demonstration of human weakness, had become the foundation for the most significant shift in galactic politics in centuries. But even as she marveled at the strategy's elegance, Kira realized they had only reached the halfway point. The real test would come when Vex learned what had been done and how he chose to respond. That test, she suspected, would finally reveal what happened when human patience truly snapped. Commander Vex received the news during what he had planned, as his final, most humiliating demand, a requirement that all human personnel prostrate themselves before entering his presence. He had called the meeting with evident satisfaction, believing he was about to deliver the killing blow to human dignity. Instead, he found himself facing something no Vellani had encountered in over a century: organized, unified resistance backed by overwhelming force. The briefing room had been reconfigured since their last meeting, where before the Vellani delegation had sat at the head of the table in positions of implied authority. Now they found themselves outnumbered and surrounded. Representatives from 6 species sat around the expanded table, their diverse forms united in shared purpose. Tom entered last, carrying a datapad and wearing an expression of polite professionalism that somehow managed to be more intimidating than any display of anger. He took his seat directly across from Vex and began speaking without preamble. "Commander Vex, I'd like to introduce you to some colleagues. Ambassador Thorak represents the Christorian Republic, whose colony ships you diverted 3 years ago. Captain Zeller speaks for the Mirren Confederacy, whose trade routes you blockaded last year. Dr. Weiss is here on behalf of the Academic Consortium, documenting Vellani expansionist policies across the sector." Each introduction was delivered in Tom's calm, measured tone, but Kira could see Vex's confidence crumbling with every name. These weren't random diplomatic contacts. They were carefully chosen representatives of every species the Vellani had victimized or threatened. "The purpose of this meeting," Tom continued, "is to present you with some options regarding your mission. Here." He activated his datapad, and the room's main display screen filled with a detailed timeline. Every provocation, every unreasonable demand, every insulting comment Vex had made over the past months was documented with timestamp, witness verification, and cross-referenced analysis. "Option 1, Tom said, conversational, is that you complete your mission as originally intended. You file your report with the High Council, documenting humanity's supposed weakness and recommending whatever territorial or economic concessions your government desires." Vex leaned forward, confusion replacing arrogance. This wasn't how defeated species were supposed to behave. "Option 2, Tom continued, is that you review the additional materials we've prepared. The display changed, showing a comprehensive intelligence analysis of Vellani military capabilities, economic vulnerabilities, and political fault lines. The level of detail was staggering. Ship designs, fleet deployment patterns, resource allocation models, even psychological profiles of key decision-makers. Kira felt her blood turn cold as she realized what she was seeing. While humanity had been displaying infinite patience on the surface, they had been conducting the most thorough intelligence-gathering operation in galactic history underneath. "This is impossible," Vex whispered. "Our security protocols are quite good," Tom agreed, "but not perfect, and certainly not designed to handle coordinated intelligence sharing between 14 species, each contributing their own unique capabilities and perspectives." The display shifted again, showing military deployment maps. Kira recognized the Terran Federation's fleet positions, but they were augmented by ships from a dozen other species, all strategically positioned around key Villani systems. Option 3, Tom said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is that you return to the High Council with a different message. You tell them that their expansion has reached its natural limits, and that further aggressive action will be met with collective response. For the first time since Kira had known him, Commander Vex looked genuinely afraid. You cannot be serious. The Villani Empire has dominated this sector for exactly as long as you were allowed to, Tom interrupted. And there it was. The moment Kira had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Tom's patience hadn't snapped in the explosive, violent way she'd expected. Instead, it had crystallized into something far more dangerous. Perfect. Calculated. Resolve. He hadn't lost control. He had revealed that he'd been in control all along, manipulating events with the kind of long-term strategic thinking that her species found incomprehensible. You see, Commander, you made a fundamental error in your assessment of humanity. You assumed that patience meant passivity, that our willingness to accommodate meant weakness. But patience isn't the absence of strength, it's the careful management of it. Tom stood up, his movement fluid and commanding. Around the table, the other species representatives remained perfectly still, like predators waiting for a signal. Every insult you delivered, every unreasonable demand you made, every attempt to humiliate our people, we documented it all. More than that, we shared it. We let every species in this sector see exactly what Villani diplomacy looks like when it thinks no one is watching. The display showed one final image, a formal declaration signed by representatives from 18 different species, establishing a new defensive alliance with humanity at its center. So here we are, Commander Vex. Your mission is complete, just not in the way you intended. You came here to demonstrate human weakness, and instead, you've helped us forge the strongest coalition this galaxy has seen in millennia. Tom walked around the table, his steps measured and deliberate, until he stood directly behind Vex's chair. Now comes the interesting part, he said quietly. What happens next depends entirely on the choice your High Council makes. They can accept the new reality and work toward genuine diplomatic solutions, or they can test whether this coalition is as strong as it appears. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. I strongly recommend the first option. Because, Commander, you've seen human patience in action for months now, but you haven't seen what we're capable of when that patience finally ends. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's environmental systems seemed to hold their breath. Kira stared at the human she thought she'd understood, realizing that she'd been watching a masterclass in strategic thinking disguised as simple courtesy. This wasn't just diplomacy. It was warfare conducted with smiles and coffee cups, and somehow she suspected the real battle was just beginning. In the hours following the revelation, Kira watched the station transform. The careful diplomatic facade that had characterized every interaction for months simply evaporated, replaced by something that felt like the calm after a storm, or perhaps the quiet before a much larger one. Commander Vex had retreated to his quarters with his staff, ostensibly to consider the options presented. But Kira could see through the observation ports that several ships had appeared at the edge of the system, Villani vessels maintaining what they probably thought was a discreet distance while their commander decided how to respond. Tom, meanwhile, had become a different person entirely. Gone was the gentle giant who had patiently endured months of provocation. In his place stood someone who moved with the quiet confidence of a chess master who had been thinking 15 moves ahead while his opponent struggled with basic tactics. You're not surprised by their response, Kira observed, finding him on the observation deck where they had shared so many morning conversations. No, Tom replied, watching the distant ships through the transparent aluminum. Vex was always going to escalate rather than admit defeat. The Villani political structure doesn't reward backing down, even when backing down is the intelligent choice. He handed her a cup of coffee, still prepared exactly to her preferences, she noticed, even as everything else changed around them. The question is whether their High Council will be wiser than their field commander. As if summoned by his words, The station's alert system chimed softly. A new transmission was incoming from the Vellani ships, not a communication request, but a formal demand for Vex's immediate extraction and the dissolution of the newly formed alliance. Tom read the transmission with the same calm expression he'd worn while enduring months of insults. But when he looked up, Kira saw something in his eyes that made her step back involuntarily. "They're going to try to take him by force," she whispered. "Yes," Tom agreed. "They are." The transformation that followed was unlike anything Kira had witnessed in her years of studying human behavior. Tom activated his personal communicator with a series of codes she'd never heard before, and suddenly the station buzzed with activity. Personnel moved with military precision, sealing sections, activating defensive systems, and preparing for what could only be described as a siege. But more impressive than the station's response was what happened beyond its hull. The ships that had been positioned throughout the system, vessels Kira had assumed were standard diplomatic escorts, revealed themselves as something far more substantial. Defense platforms that had been disguised as asteroids powered up their weapon systems. Cloaked vessels shimmered into visibility, surrounding the Vellani fleet in a carefully orchestrated display of overwhelming force. "How long?" Kira asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been preparing for this possibility since the day Vex arrived," Tom replied. "Every species in the Alliance contributed ships, personnel, and intelligence. We just kept them hidden until we needed them." The scope of the deception was breathtaking. For months, while appearing to be the victim of Vellani manipulation, humanity had been orchestrating the most complex, multi-species military operation in galactic history. They had turned Vex's provocations into justification for unprecedented cooperation between former rivals and neutral parties. The communication system crackled with an incoming message from the lead Vellani vessel. Vex's face appeared on the main screen, but his earlier arrogance had been replaced with barely controlled desperation. "This is an act of war," he declared. "The Vellani Empire will not tolerate the detention of our diplomatic personnel." Tom stepped forward, his response calm and measured. "Commander Vex is free to leave at any time. However, he and his delegation will be departing aboard one of our vessels under diplomatic escort to ensure their safe return to Vellani space." "Unacceptable. Our ships will extract our personnel immediately." "No," Tom replied, and that single word carried more finality than any threat. "They will not." What followed was a masterclass in applied psychology. Tom began broadcasting the complete record of Vex's behavior to every ship in the system, Vellani vessels included. The documentation was comprehensive and devastating, showing not just the commander's provocations, but the calculated nature of his mission. More importantly, Tom included analysis of similar Vellani operations against other species, complete with casualty reports and economic damage assessments. He wasn't just justifying the current response, he was educating the Vellani crews about their government's true methods and costs. The effect was immediate and visible. Several Vellani ships began powering down their weapons systems. Internal communications channels, which the Alliance had been monitoring, filled with heated discussions about the morality of their mission. "Your crews can see the truth now," Tom broadcast to the Vellani commander. "They understand what their government sent them to accomplish and what it has cost the galaxy. The question is whether you'll force them to die for a lie." The standoff continued for 3 more hours, with Vellani reinforcements arriving, only to find themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered at every turn. The Alliance's response was perfectly calibrated, overwhelming enough to discourage aggression, but restrained enough to avoid triggering a larger conflict. Finally, as the local star began to set behind the station's bulk, the lead Vellani vessel powered down its weapons and requested permission to withdraw. Tom granted it immediately, along with safe passage for the entire fleet, but his final transmission carried a weight that resonated through every ship in the system. The Alliance will remember this day, and so will every species watching these events unfold. The age of unilateral expansion is over. From now on, aggression will be met with unified response, and patience will be rewarded with genuine cooperation. As the Vellani ships departed, Carrying Commander Vex and his thoroughly chastened delegation, Kira found herself staring at Tom with a mixture of awe and concern. "What happens now?" she asked. Tom's smile returned, not the careful diplomatic expression she'd grown accustomed to, but something genuine and perhaps slightly frightening in its confidence. "Now we find out whether the Villani High Council is wiser than their commanders. And if they're not—" He paused, watching the last of their ships disappear into hyperspace. "Well, they've had months to observe human patience in action. Perhaps it's time they learned what we're capable of when that patience is no longer required." 6. Months later, Kira stood in the same observation deck where she had first witnessed Tom's infinite patience. The view had changed dramatically. Where once a small diplomatic station had orbited Earth, now a sprawling complex housed the headquarters of what historians were already calling the Galactic Cooperation Initiative. Ships from dozens of species moved in carefully coordinated patterns, their crews working together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system of isolated competition. Trade flowed more freely than ever before. Scientific discoveries were shared openly, and for the first time in generations, smaller species could develop without fear of arbitrary conquest. The Villani Empire still existed, but as a much diminished shadow of its former self. The High Council had ultimately chosen wisdom over pride, accepting the new reality and working toward genuine diplomatic solutions. Commander Vex had been quietly reassigned to a remote agricultural colony, where his talents for provocation were less likely to trigger interstellar incidents. "You changed everything," Kira said, watching Tom review the morning's reports with the same methodical care he'd once devoted to accommodating impossible demands. "We changed everything," Tom corrected gently. "None of this would have been possible without cooperation from every species involved. Humans provided the catalyst, but the reaction required everyone's participation. It was a typical human response, Kira had learned, deflecting credit while taking responsibility, but she knew better now. She had watched Tom orchestrate the most significant shift in galactic politics in millennia, all while maintaining the facade of simple diplomatic courtesy. "I still don't understand how you knew it would work," she admitted. "The risks were enormous. If even one species had betrayed the alliance, if the Villani had responded with immediate violence, if any of 1,000 variables had gone wrong—" Tom was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "There's another human saying you haven't heard yet. Fortune favors the bold. But that's only half the truth. The complete version is, fortune favors the bold, who prepare for every contingency." He gestured toward the bustling activity visible through the observation port. "We didn't just hope this would work, Kira. We planned for every possible outcome, prepared contingencies for every scenario we could imagine, and built redundancies into every system. When we finally acted, we were as certain as anyone can be, in an uncertain universe. And if you had been wrong," Tom's expression grew serious, "then we would have faced the consequences and tried something else. That's what patience really means. Not passive acceptance, but the willingness to wait for the right moment while preparing for every possibility." A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission. The main display activated to show a familiar scene: the council chambers of a dozen different species, their representatives gathered for the daily coordination meeting that had become the foundation of galactic governance. As Tom prepared to join the session, Kira found herself reflecting on everything she had witnessed. The gentle giant who had endured months of provocation had revealed himself to be something far more complex and dangerous, a strategist capable of thinking in timeframes and scales that dwarfed conventional military planning. But perhaps most remarkably, he had accomplished it all without losing the essential qualities that had made him effective in the first place. He was still patient, still careful, still willing to listen and accommodate reasonable requests. The difference was that now everyone understood the steel foundation underlying that gentle surface. "Tom," she called as he headed toward the communication center. "What's next?" He paused, that familiar smile crossing his face. "Now we do the hard part, Kira. Building a galaxy where patience is rewarded, cooperation is valued, and no one has to test the limits of anyone else's endurance." And if someone does test those limits? Tom's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes, a reminder of the moment when his patience had finally crystallized into perfect, calculated resolve. "Well," he said quietly, "they'll discover what every bully learns eventually. There's always someone bigger, stronger, and more patient than you are. The trick is making sure they learn that lesson before anyone gets hurt." As Tom walked away to join the council session, Kira remained at the observation port, watching the ships move in their careful patterns against the backdrop of Earth's blue marble. She thought about the moment she had first seen something dangerous flicker behind Tom's gentle eyes, and how that moment had led to the complete restructuring of galactic civilization. The alien girl would never forget the moment a human's patience finally snapped, not because it had resulted in violence or destruction, but because it had revealed the true power of strategic thinking coupled with infinite preparation. Tom's patience hadn't broken. It had evolved into something far more sophisticated and effective than simple endurance. In the end, the most terrifying thing about human patience wasn't what happened when it ran out. It was what humans accomplished while they were waiting for the right moment to act. They had turned perceived weakness into actual strength, diplomatic courtesy into strategic advantage, and months of apparent suffering into the foundation for a new galactic order. The Villani had tested human limits and found them to be far more flexible and dangerous than anyone had imagined. They had pushed and prodded, expecting to find the breaking point of human tolerance, only to discover that they had been playing a game whose rules they never understood, against opponents who were thinking decades ahead while appearing to focus on the next 5 minutes. Now, as ships from across the galaxy worked together in unprecedented harmony, Kira understood that she had witnessed something that would be studied and remembered for millennia. Not the moment when human patience snapped, but the moment when it revealed its true nature, not as a simple virtue or weakness, but as the foundation for the most sophisticated form of warfare ever devised. A warfare that conquered without destroying, that won by making enemies into allies, and that achieved total victory by convincing everyone involved that they had chosen cooperation freely. The humans, Kira realized, had not just won a diplomatic battle. They had redefined what victory itself could mean, and in doing so, they had changed the galaxy forever. As she watched the sun set behind the sprawling station complex, casting long shadows across the diplomatic quarters where representatives from dozens of species worked together in harmony, Kira smiled. The universe had become a much more interesting place the day Commander Vex decided to test human patience. And somewhere in the diplomatic archives, meticulously documented and cross-referenced, lay the complete record of exactly how that test had been turned into the foundation for galactic peace. Future generations would study those records, learning not just what had happened, but how patience, properly applied, could move entire civilizations. The alien girl would never forget. And thanks to human thoroughness, neither would anyone else.